In 1999, NATO dropped more than 23,000 bombs on a European country without a single UN green light. Yeah, you heard that right. This wasn't Iraq. This wasn't Afghanistan. This was Serbia. And the reason? To stop what they called ethnic cleansing in a small province named Kosovo. But here's where it gets wild. This war wasn't just about saving lives. It was about power, politics, and a move that would change how wars are fought forever. You're about to see how a local rebellion turned into an international air war, how diplomacy crumbled overnight, and how one decision by NATO still sparks debate to this day. So buckle up, because the story of the Kosovo War and Operation Allied Force isn't just history. It's a masterclass in how far the world will go when morality and authority collide. Picture this. It's 1999, and the night sky over Europe glows with fire. NATO jets are streaking across the clouds, dropping bombs on Serbia, a European nation. And here's the shocking part. They did it without the United Nations ever saying yes. Sounds insane, right? A military alliance acting on its own, unleashing thousands of airstrikes, claiming it was all to stop ethnic cleansing in a place most people back then could barely find on a map, Kosovo. But behind that one word, Kosovo, there's a storm of history, rebellion, and politics that exploded into a war no one could ignore. On one side, you had the Serbian government, led by Slobodan Milosevic, determined to crush a rebel movement and keep control of what they saw as the cradle of their nation. On the other side, the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA, a small but fierce group of Albanian fighters demanding independence after years of repression. And caught in between, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, families, farmers, kids, running for their lives as villages burned and gunfire echoed through the valleys. The world watched in horror. Diplomacy failed, negotiations fell apart, and when the reports of massacres and mass graves began to surface, NATO decided it couldn't wait for permission anymore. What followed was a 78-day bombing campaign that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. It was the first time in history that NATO went to war, not to defend its members, but to stop a humanitarian disaster. Some called it justice. Others called it aggression. But one thing's for sure, it was a turning point. Because after Kosovo, the world would never look at intervention the same way again. And that's what we're diving into today. How a small corner of the Balkans became the center of global attention, how diplomacy turned into air raids, and how Operation Allied Force became one of the most controversial missions of our time. To really understand how the Kosovo War started, we've got to go back a bit to the messy breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. Yugoslavia used to be one big country, kind of like a patchwork quilt made up of different ethnic groups, languages, and religions. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Albanians, all living under one flag for decades. It wasn't perfect, but for a long time it worked, until it didn't. When Yugoslavia started to fall apart, every piece of that patchwork wanted to go its own way. Slovenia and Croatia left first, then Bosnia, and each time, things turned violent. By the time the dust started to settle, one region was still holding on under Serbian control, Kosovo. Now here's where the tension really starts to build. Kosovo was home to about 90% ethnic Albanians, but it was still officially part of Serbia, and that didn't sit well with either side. For ethnic Albanians living there, Serbia's government meant oppression, second-class treatment, and no say in their own future. For the Serbs, especially those who followed the nationalist leader Slobodan Milosevic, Kosovo wasn't just another piece of land, it was sacred. They called it the heart of Serbia, the birthplace of their history and faith. So you can imagine, when the majority in Kosovo started pushing for independence, Serbia wasn't having it. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Milosevic rose to power using fiery nationalist speeches about defending Serbian pride and protecting Kosovo. He took away Kosovo's autonomy, basically its right to govern itself, and placed it directly under Belgrade's control. For the Albanian population, that was like a slap in the face. Schools were shut down, Albanian teachers and civil servants were fired. Even hospitals were told to replace Albanian staff with Serbs. Life became a daily struggle, but at first the Albanian community didn't fight back with guns. They tried peaceful resistance. A quiet man named Ibrahim Rogovai became the face of this nonviolent movement. He built underground schools, secret universities, and a parallel government, basically saying, we'll build our own country from the ground up, even if no one recognizes it. But as the years passed, patience started to run out. Nothing was changing. The world was busy dealing with Bosnia's war and the aftermath of genocide there. Kosovo's suffering barely made the headlines. And that's when a new group started to rise, the KLA, or Kosovo Liberation Army. These weren't polished soldiers. They were local fighters, villagers, farmers, and young men who decided that if peaceful protests couldn't free Kosovo, then maybe force could. They began attacking Serbian police stations, ambushing convoys, and declaring open rebellion. Serbia's response? Brutal. The Yugoslav army and Serbian police launched massive crackdowns, burning villages, rounding up men, and killing anyone suspected of helping the KLA. Thousands of civilians were caught in the middle. By 1998, Kosovo was in full-blown chaos. Imagine this, entire families hiding in the woods, villages turned to ash, roads filled with refugees carrying whatever they could on their backs. Western journalists who visited described scenes that looked straight out of World War II. That's when the international community, especially NATO and the United States, started to pay attention. Because after Bosnia's genocide earlier in the decade, nobody wanted to say again, we didn't know. The pressure on Serbia was growing, but so was Milosevic's defiance. He believed Kosovo was a domestic issue, not the world's business. And that's how it all set the stage for what came next. The failed peace talks, the collapse of diplomacy, and finally NATO stepping in with bombs instead of words. The world was about to cross a line, from negotiation to intervention, and once it did, there was no going back. By late 1998, Kosovo was on fire, and the world was running out of patience. Villages were being burned to the ground, columns of refugees were spilling across borders, and horrifying images of massacres were hitting Western television screens almost daily. It wasn't just another regional conflict anymore. It had become a moral test for the international community. The big question everyone was asking was, how far should the world go to stop what was happening? You see, by this point, Western countries, especially the United States and European allies, were terrified of another Bosnia. Just a few years earlier, the world had stood by as thousands were slaughtered during the Bosnian War. No one wanted that stain on history again, so the international community jumped into action. In late 1998, under pressure from NATO, Serbia agreed to let international monitors, basically observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, enter Kosovo. Their job was to make sure Serbian forces were pulling back and civilians were protected. On paper, that sounded like a step toward peace, but in reality, nothing really changed. The KLA kept attacking Serbian positions, and Serbian forces kept retaliating even harder. The breaking point came in January 1999 in a small village called Rachak. When international monitors arrived there, they discovered dozens of bodies, men, women, even elderly people. Many shot at close range. It was described as a massacre. Western leaders saw it as undeniable proof that Serbia was committing atrocities. Serbia, on the other hand, claimed it was a stage setup, saying the dead were KLA fighters, not civilians. But for NATO, Rachak was the moment the clock started ticking. The message from Washington and London was clear. Either peace is signed now or force will follow. So in February 1999, they tried one last time to avoid war. Diplomats from the United States, Britain, France, and others gathered both sides in a French chateau near Paris. The Rambouillet peace talks. The idea was simple: create a peace plan that would stop the fighting, pull Serbian troops out of Kosovo, and bring in an international peacekeeping force to protect civilians. Kosovo would remain part of Serbia for now, but with self-rule and elections. It sounded like a middle ground. The Kosovo Albanians, represented by the KLA and political leaders, reluctantly agreed. They didn't love the deal, but they were desperate for help. Serbia, though, completely rejected it. The deal included one specific clause that Milosevic couldn't accept. It allowed NATO troops to enter not just Kosovo, but all of Serbia to enforce the peace. For him, that was humiliation. It meant letting a foreign military occupy his country. Talks dragged on for weeks, and every handshake photo op meant nothing. Behind closed doors, both sides refused to budge. Western diplomats, including U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, kept warning Milosevic that if he didn't sign, NATO would take action. He didn't believe them. Serbia had survived sanctions and isolation before. He thought NATO was bluffing. But they weren't. When the peace talks finally collapsed in March 1999, NATO leaders gathered and agreed. Diplomacy had failed. The images of Racek were still fresh, and public pressure to do something was enormous. The United Nations, however, was not on board. Russia and China, both allies of Serbia, made it clear they would veto any resolution authorizing force. That meant NATO had a choice: either step back and watch the bloodshed continue, or act without UN approval. And that's exactly what they did. For the first time in history, NATO decided to launch a military operation on its own, without a UN mandate, claiming it was a humanitarian intervention to stop atrocities. On March 24, 1999, at 8 p.m. local time, the decision turned into reality. Air raid sirens screamed across Serbia, and the first missiles lit up the Skopje. The diplomacy was over. Operation Allied Force had begun. It's March 24, 1999. The night sky over Serbia suddenly lights up. The deep rumble of jet engines cuts through the air as NATO's fighter planes, American F-15, British Tornadoes, French Mirages, begin their attack runs. Their targets? Serbian military positions, radar stations, power plants, and communication hubs. Operation Allied Force had officially begun. The mission was bold and risky. NATO wasn't defending one of its own members this time. It was striking a sovereign country to stop human rights abuses. And remember, they were doing it without UN approval. The official goal was simple: force Slobodan Milosevic to pull his troops and police out of Kosovo, end the violence against civilians, and allow international peacekeepers to take over. But as we'll see, nothing about this operation turned out simple. The plan was to rely completely on air power. No ground troops, no invasion, no soldiers storming across borders. NATO leaders believed they could bomb Serbia into submission, fast and clean, with minimal casualties. But war never goes according to plan. In the first few days, the strikes were limited, mostly against military targets and anti-aircraft systems. The idea was to pressure Milosevic, not destroy the country. But he didn't flinch. Instead, Serbian forces doubled down inside Kosovo. They began a brutal campaign on the ground, torching villages, expelling entire populations, and hunting suspected members of the Kosovo Liberation Army. It was like they were racing the clock, trying to empty Kosovo before NATO could stop them. Within days, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians were fleeing their homes. Long lines of tractors and horse carts stretched for miles toward the borders of Albania and Macedonia. Refugee camps began overflowing, and Western journalists started showing images that shocked the world. Families walking barefoot through mud, clutching whatever they could carry, with fighter jets roaring above them. And while NATO's leaders were calling the operation a humanitarian mission, many Serbs saw it as an attack on their nation's dignity. Milosevic used that anger to his advantage. Serbian state TV broadcast footage of bombed-out homes and hospitals, framing NATO as the aggressor, not the savior. Meanwhile, inside NATO headquarters, things weren't going as smoothly as they'd hoped. The Serbian military wasn't collapsing. Their air defenses were scattered and mobile, making them hard to target. And to make matters worse, the world was watching every mistake. On April 12th, a NATO missile accidentally hit a passenger train on a bridge, killing dozens. A few weeks later, another strike destroyed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese journalists. NATO said it was a tragic targeting error. They had used outdated maps. But politically, it was a nightmare. Still, despite the criticism and mounting pressure, NATO kept going. Each night, the skies over Serbia glowed orange. Entire cities went dark as power grids were bombed. Bridges over the Danube River crumbled into the water. Communication towers fell. Even Belgrade's TV headquarters, seen as a propaganda tool by the regime, it was struck, killing several employees inside. The goal had shifted. This wasn't just about Kosovo anymore. It was about breaking Milosevic's will, and little by little, it began to work. Serbia's infrastructure was collapsing. The economy was in ruins. The population was exhausted from weeks of air raids. But still, Milosevic refused to surrender. Behind the scenes, Russia, Serbia's longtime ally, started to intervene diplomatically, trying to broker a peace deal. NATO, meanwhile, expanded its target list even further, hitting government buildings and military headquarters right in Belgrade. The pressure was becoming unbearable. By early June, after 78 straight days of bombing, day and night, Milosevic finally gave in. He agreed to withdraw all Serbian forces from Kosovo, let NATO peacekeepers in, and allow refugees to return home. On June 10, 1999, NATO halted its bombing campaign. Operation Allied Force was officially over. It had lasted 78 days, involved 19 NATO countries, and fired over 23,000 bombs and missiles. Not a single NATO soldier was lost in combat, but thousands of civilians, mostly in Serbia and Kosovo, had died. And when the dust settled, one question hung in the air. Did NATO really stop a humanitarian crisis, or did it start a new one? Either way, the world had just witnessed something completely new. A war fought not for territory, not for revenge, but for the idea of humanitarian intervention. And that idea would change global politics forever. While NATO jets thundered overhead, down on the ground, it was pure hell. Kosovo wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a nightmare unfolding village by village. Families were running from burning homes. Tractors loaded with mattresses. Chickens and crying children crawled down muddy roads. People carried whatever they could, a bag of clothes, a pot, maybe a family photo, because they didn't know if they'd ever see home again. By April 1999, more than 800,000 Kosovars, that's nearly an entire nation, had fled their homes. Some escaped across the borders into Albania and Macedonia. Others hid in forests and mountains, hoping the airstrikes would somehow stop the Serbian troops chasing them. Refugee camps sprang up almost overnight. Rows of white UN tents stretched across muddy fields. Helicopters buzzed overhead, delivering aid. But even then, food was short, disease spread fast, and fear was everywhere. Imagine being one of them, hearing explosions in the distance, clutching your child's hand, not knowing if your father or brother was still alive. For so many families, that was the reality. And for the people who stayed behind in Serbia, their lives weren't much better. NATO's airstrikes didn't just hit military targets. They hit power plants, bridges, and television stations. Entire neighborhoods lost electricity for weeks. Water stopped running. Hospitals overflowed with the injured, both soldiers and civilians. In Belgrade, people lined up for hours just to buy bread. Air raid sirens blared day and night, forcing everyone into basements and shelters. Every rumble in the sky could mean another missile. Serbian state media played a constant loop of bombed-out buildings, funerals, and speeches from Milosevic calling the nation to resist foreign aggression. For many Serbs, the NATO bombing wasn't seen as liberation. It felt like punishment. And here's where the story gets complicated. NATO said it was bombing to stop ethnic cleansing. But many human rights groups later reported that during the bombing, Serbian forces actually intensified their campaign against ethnic Albanians. Villages were emptied faster than ever. Thousands of men disappeared, later found in mass graves. So on one hand, NATO's war was meant to protect people, but on the ground, it sometimes made things worse before they got better. One haunting image that went viral at the time was of a long, endless line of refugees walking through the mountains into Albania. Old men carrying babies, women helping the elderly, kids wrapped in blankets. Reporters described it as a river of humanity. Meanwhile, back in Serbia, another kind of tragedy was unfolding. On May 1st, a NATO missile hit a bus full of civilians near the town of Lujane, killing dozens, including children. A week later, another strike hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, a mistake that killed 3 journalists. Each of these moments added fuel to the anger. Even NATO supporters began to ask, are we saving lives or taking them? It was a war that blurred every moral line. And through it all, the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, kept fighting. They knew the bombing might weaken Serbia, so they tried to reclaim ground, ambushing Serbian patrols and clashing in small villages. But they were outgunned and outnumbered. For most people on the ground, there were no sides anymore, just survival. By May 1999, entire towns were ghost cities. Smoke rose from blackened houses. Roads were littered with burned-out cars and livestock. Aid groups described Kosovo as one of the largest humanitarian disasters in Europe since World War II. And that's what forced the world to face a painful truth. Stopping a war from the sky didn't automatically save the people below. The humanitarian crisis was out of control, and the pressure on NATO to end it, once and for all, was building by the day. By late May 1999, the war had reached a boiling point. NATO had been bombing for over 2 months. Bridges, airfields, factories, you name it. But Serbia wasn't giving up. If anything, Milosevic was digging in deeper. And NATO? They were running out of patience and targets. Every day, international pressure mounted. Refugees were flooding Europe. News channels were filled with images of shattered cities and burned villages. Politicians were being grilled on live TV. How much longer will this last? Something had to give. And that's when the turning points started to come. Not just from bombs, but from politics, diplomacy, and a dose of sheer exhaustion. Let's rewind to early June. Inside Serbia, life had become unbearable. Infrastructure was collapsing. No power, no water, no money. Gas stations ran dry. Supermarket shelves were empty. People were exhausted and terrified. Even Serbia's allies were beginning to waver. Russia, who had defended Milosevic from the start, started to signal that maybe, just maybe, it was time to talk peace. Behind closed doors, Russian envoy Viktor Chernomyrdin met with U.S. diplomat Strobe Talbot. Together they drafted what would become the plan to end the war, one that would let Serbia save face while allowing NATO to declare success. The offer was simple on paper but massive in impact. Serbia would pull its troops out of Kosovo, NATO would stop bombing, and an international peacekeeping force, led by NATO, would enter Kosovo to protect civilians and maintain order. But here's what really broke the deadlock. On May 7th, NATO accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. 3 journalists were killed. The incident triggered global outrage. Suddenly, NATO's humanitarian mission was under intense scrutiny. Critics asked, how can we claim to protect lives when we're killing innocent people? The pressure was now on both sides. NATO needed an endgame. Serbia needed a lifeline. Around the same time, NATO stepped up its campaign. They began targeting Milosevic's inner circle, government buildings, military headquarters, and communication networks. Belgrade was plunged into darkness. The message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. Meanwhile, reports of atrocities in Kosovo continued to surface. Satellite images showed villages burned to the ground. Western intelligence estimated that over 10,000 ethnic Albanians had been killed. The world's outrage reached its peak. It became impossible for any leader, even Russia's, to defend Serbia's actions anymore. And then, almost overnight, the tone shifted. On June 3, 1999, Milosevic finally accepted the peace terms. He realized Serbia was isolated, bombed into ruin, and on the brink of economic collapse. The people had nothing left to give. NATO called for a temporary suspension of bombing, but only after verifying that Serbian troops were actually withdrawing. Over the next week, NATO reconnaissance planes confirmed long lines of Yugoslav tanks and trucks retreating north out of Kosovo. And just like that, after 78 days of relentless airstrikes, Operation Allied Force was over. The skies over Serbia went silent. On June 10th, the United Nations passed Resolution 1244, officially ending the conflict and placing Kosovo under international administration. NATO troops, nearly 50,000 of them, moved in as peacekeepers under a mission called KFOR. The war was done, but the story wasn't over. Kosovo lay in ruins. Over 13,000 people were dead, mostly civilians. Thousands more were missing. Cities were reduced to rubble. And yet, for many Kosovars, there was a strange sense of relief. They had survived. Serbia had left, and for the first time in a decade, they believed freedom might finally be possible. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, Milosevic tried to spin the retreat as a strategic victory, but everyone knew it was the beginning of his end. A year later, he'd be voted out and handed over to The Hague to face war crimes charges. Operation Allied Force didn't look like a traditional victory. There was no invasion, no surrender ceremony, but it was a new kind of war. One fought almost entirely from the air, with political strategy and moral justification as its main weapons. And that experiment, for better or worse, would go on to define how the West would fight wars in the 21st century. When the bombing stopped in June 1999, the world exhaled. After 78 straight days of explosions, sirens, and chaos, silence finally returned to the skies over the Balkans. But down on the ground, the silence was haunting. Kosovo was a land of ghosts. Whole villages had been wiped off the map. Roads were cratered. Fields were littered with unexploded bombs. Families came back to their homes, or what was left of them, to find only ashes. Some found graves where their houses used to be. In total, more than 13,000 people were killed during the war, most of them ethnic Albanians. Over 1 million had been forced to flee their homes. And now, with NATO peacekeepers entering, they began to return. But this return wasn't peaceful either. Angry and traumatized, many Albanians sought revenge. Serbian civilians in Kosovo, the ones who hadn't already fled, suddenly became targets. Homes were burned, people were attacked, and ancient Serbian churches were vandalized. In a tragic twist, the war that was supposed to end ethnic violence had only flipped who was suffering. NATO peacekeepers, known as KFOR, now had to protect the very people their bombs had been used against just weeks earlier. It was a tense, fragile peace, one that could break at any time. Meanwhile, the political chessboard in the Balkans started to shift. Kosovo was placed under UN administration, meaning it wasn't officially independent yet, but Serbia no longer controlled it. NATO forces patrolled the streets, international organizations set up offices, and aid groups rushed in to rebuild what they could. Slobodan Milosevic, the man who had ruled Serbia with an iron fist, returned to Belgrade a broken leader. His people were angry. The economy was in ruins. Sanctions and bombings had left the country isolated and impoverished. Within a year, protests filled Belgrade's streets. The same man who once stood up to NATO now faced his own citizens demanding his resignation. And by 2000, Milosevic was gone, ousted from power and later arrested for war crimes. For Kosovo, this was just the beginning of a long, complicated journey. Under the UN's temporary rule, Kosovo slowly started rebuilding. Schools reopened. Markets came back. Roads were cleared. But independence, the dream that fueled the war, was still out of reach. It would take 9 more years for that to happen. In 2008, Kosovo finally declared independence from Serbia. Some countries, like the United States and most of Europe, recognized it immediately. Others, including Russia, China, and Serbia itself, still don't recognize it to this day. Even now, more than 2 decades later, Kosovo's independence is still disputed. Serbia considers it a breakaway province, while Kosovars see it as their hard-earned freedom. And that question, was it worth it, still hangs in the air. Operation Allied Force was hailed by some